Welcome to the CEC Report for November the 14th, 2014. I'm Elisa Barwick, and with me today is Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, Mark Carney announces bail-in plan for G20, and APEC Summit proves transatlantic order on decline. Now, firstly, on bail-in. Now, we have been talking about this, especially over the last year, in the lead up to the G20, that the plan all along has been that all the G20 nations must have bail-in laws that will be universally applicable worldwide in place by that time.
Yeah, for any of our new viewers, Elisa, who haven't been following this show, bail-in is what happened in Cyprus in March last year, where the European government mandated that the depositors of the banks in Cyprus were actually going to be seized. And that's actually what took place. So the intention of bail-in was to seize deposits, your deposits. And that's what we've been talking about for the last, really over 2 years now.
And this is something that had come up initially after the 2008 GFC. And in 2009, the G20 commissioned the Financial Stability Board, which is run out of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, to put together the plan. So Mark Carney, who's the head of the Bank of England, he's in charge of this because he also doubles as the head of the FSB. Now, he came out on Monday, because we did talk about the prospect of this in last week's show, but the details became clear when he gave a press conference on Monday after a meeting. This was the 10th of November in Basel, Switzerland, where he came out and he said, okay, this is a watershed moment. We have drawn up the plans. We have reached agreement on the plans for too big to fail banks, which will be expected to be passed at the G20 Brisbane Summit, which is this weekend. He said, instead of having the public, governments and the taxpayer rescue banks when things go wrong, the creditors of banks, the big institutions that hold the bank's debt, not the depositors, will become the new shareholders of banks if banks make mistakes. Now, Craig, why did he put such emphasis on not the depositors?
Well, look, if you go back to the uproar that happened back in March of last year, when they actually did steal the ordinary deposits of the people who had deposits in two of the banks in Cyprus, this created an absolute outrage around the world. People didn't know that the governments were going to be capable of this. And I think that they overplayed their hand, but it also showed their intention. What we did here in Australia was went on a massive mobilisation to make sure that the people of Australia knew what was going on here. And we actually found the information that there was actually legislation in train. They themselves told us that, to actually have bail-in come to Australia. So we, as I said, we mobilised this. We talked to thousands upon thousands of people and published a full-page ad in the Australian last December, December 3rd, don't seize our bank accounts past Glass-Steagall. And we made Glass-Steagall the issue for the country, because what is Glass-Steagall? What Mark Carney and his banker cohorts want to do is they want to preserve the too big to fail banks at all costs. They want to shift the liabilities that they have if they're too big to fail. If they go bankrupt, they don't want the banks to suffer. They don't want the holders of toxic derivatives, the fund managers of hedge funds and so forth, to suffer the losses. They want to shift the blame onto depositors. That's what they initially said, or now the actual other creditors. So what we've campaigned for the last year, and actually not longer than that, is for Glass-Steagall. And we produce this magazine, Glass-Steagall Now, which is available for people who want a copy of this. It does have a $25 price tag on it, but we'll give it free to any person who wants to call in so that they understand what the full issues are. But we campaigned for Glass-Steagall, which is the lawful separation by law of the large too big to fail banks into their constituent parts. We need a viable and functional commercial banking system that handles mortgages, it handles loans, that lends money into the economy. What we don't need is these huge conglomerates of merchant banks that speculate with people's money, investment banks, insurance houses, stockbroking houses, and commercial banks all rolled into one, with access to the depositors' funds to speculate with in the global financial system, and literally put everyone's savings and put the economy at risk.
And speaking of those kinds of funds, that is what is going to be exposed under what Mark Carney announced, because just to give the details, what he announced is that the world's 30 largest banks, the globally significant institutions, will have to keep 16 to 20% of their risk-weighted assets in the form of bail-inable bonds. So together with increased capital reserves, which have already been mandated, this will bring the total buffer up to 20 to 25%. Now those bonds will be sold at higher interest rates, but of course once the bank is in trouble, if it runs into trouble, they will be written off.
Yep.
And you're talking with 16 to 20% of these big banks' portfolios, masses, trillions, a couple of $1 trillion at least here. Now the fact that this is going to force the people to pay, even though Carney insisted not the depositors, is revealed in a clip I now want to play. This is the former Bank of England Deputy Governor Paul Tucker speaking at a November 5th event of bank regulators and economists at George Washington University. So he's talking here about who's going to carry the can under the bail-in procedures.
So I'll repeat the questions just to make sure everyone hears them. So who's writing this effective insurance policy in the entire system? I guess AIG was doing this before. Perhaps they're no longer available. I'm not sure. But yeah. So who is? We'll go. Paul. We'll everyone have a go on all these questions. We'll go this way. This one.
So first of all, and I hope we'll see this in Brisbane, and if not afterwards, you absolutely can't allow banks and shadow banks to hold it. That leaves you with
hedge funds.
I'm just going to get to a point about the economics of this. So that leaves you with insurance companies, pension funds, mutual funds, etc. And when I've said that in other groups, people have said, my goodness, it's households. Well, households are going to take the losses as taxpayers. Well, there are only households. This is all about agency problems. I mean, the ultimate judgment that's going on here is, do we think there is going to be more discipline through households as taxpayers taking the losses and hiring supervisors, or do we think there is going to be more market discipline by households as beneficiaries of insurance policies and pension funds taking it that way and hiring asset managers and others? And one reason for believing that's better is that at least you've doubled up. You've still got the supervisors, but now you've got BlackRock and PIMCO as well. But, you know, do the losses flow through to households? Yes. The point about systemic risk, you didn't put the point this way, but I've heard Giles Goodhart a number of times say, well, this will work if it's an idiosyncratic problem, but it won't work if there's, if it kind of loads of them go. Now, I'd make 2 points about that, a lesser point and a bigger point. The lesser point is that even in the really big financial crises over the past century, very few of the big systemic firms go on the same day. There is a sequence. And secondly, and more importantly, at worst, this is burden sharing between the taxpayer, households as taxpayer, and households as indirect holders of these bonds. And so you still get the market discipline up to a point.
So in case you didn't think you heard that right, he said, do the losses flow through to the households? Yes. And what's more, this is burden sharing. The people are just picking up their share of the burden for the bank's excessive speculation.
Superannuation funds, Elisa, everyone has to have them, it's compulsory these days. The fund managers, these are the ones that they're going to be sold to here in Australia. They're going to be looking for profits. They're going to go to the highest possible returns on bonds. They're going to be the bail-inable bonds.
Absolutely.
The households aren't even going to know where their money's going to go, and that's where the risk comes in. But this is planned, this is insidious, it's a form of fraud. So people who are watching the CEC report, you've been warned. Go check out your superannuation and ask these questions. Is my super going to be put into bail-inable bonds?
And it's really a creation of a whole new bubble of this new trade in this new form of bonds. So it's just going to make matters worse and expose the people even further. Now we'll stop briefly, but we'll keep talking about this and a bit more about Glass-Steagall and the solution after this break. So we're talking about the prospect of having a whole new category of bonds held by the major banks, bail-inable bonds, which is expected to be accepted at this weekend's G20 summit.
I think, Elisa, I just want to pull you up there, because what they've actually said is they don't want the banks and the too big to fail banks to have these bonds. They're not to be sold to the banks. They're
Not to each other, no.
No, they're going to be sold
They issue them, but they've got to sell them to
superannuation funds. So this is that's who's actually have to buy this, not the banks themselves, but the superannuation funds, the pension funds, you know, where there's huge pool of money. Like in Australia, we have $1.8 trillion worth of, you know, money in superannuation funds. That's the target here.
And that's what we heard Paul Tucker admitting in that last clip. And I want to show another clip from the same event, and again it's Paul Tucker. This clip though starts with a questioner who proposes that this is a preposterous idea and that these kind of institutions shouldn't be allowed to exist if they're that incapable of keeping themselves going. And Tucker raises the spectre of Glass-Steagall, although he doesn't use that term, which is the alternative on the table and which the G20 could take up. So listen to this.
I appreciate the candor with which the panelists have talked about SPOE, but let's boil it down to its essentials. We're basically saying that the most sophisticated, most talented risk managers will be the Wall Street creditors and the operating subsidiaries, repo lenders, derivatives counterparties, what have you. They will not be touched. They will be guaranteed from any loss whatsoever. As you said, all the losses are going to be imposed on the households who indirectly hold the bail-in debt through insurance companies, through pension funds, through mutual funds. So the stupidest investors, the least able to monitor what's going on, are going to end up bearing the loss. So now we have is a pensioner,
that's a slur
ordinary investor bailout any better than a taxpayer bailout? But what we're being told is these institutions cannot survive, cannot exist, except in a setting where either they impose their losses on taxpayers or they impose their losses on households through investment losses. And I think you have to ask yourself, is this the kind of institution that is safe to operate when the households are basically going to end up holding the bag either way? Because the feeling is if the Wall Street is going to hold any of the losses, they're going to run.
This is an extraordinary comment. I'm merely making a point about the corporate veil. So say there's a different structure where Wall Street firms take losses. So who does that mean? That means households take losses. There are only households. That is the only point I was making. Now, you sound as though you'd like to break up these firms. Well, there wasn't political support for that from the G20 leaders, democratically elected leaders, and some leaders who weren't democratically elected. The question then is what to do. Now, you know, this is a kind of grander version of my response to Anat. You then have to explore all the routes, and maybe none of them will work. But your protest is irrelevant to whether or not this works. Your protest amounts to you'd like the world to be different. Well, that's why we have democracy. And you've just had a vote in the country, and we'll see what happens.
Well, nothing will happen as a result of that one, but
So he was a bit taken aback there by the reality, the truth of the matter being just stated. But Craig, why would Glass-Steagall laws stop the need for this type of bail-in?
Glass-Steagall, Elisa, as it was brought in by Roosevelt, was designed to protect the general welfare of the population. It wasn't designed to protect and preserve the big banks. You know, in the 1930s, you had the crash of many, many, many banks because they were involved in high levels of speculation, somewhat exactly what we have today. What Roosevelt brought in with the Glass-Steagall bill was the fact that he said, no, you have to have a highly regulated, protected commercial banking system that is only allowed to do the business of banking. And the other stuff like the investment banking, which gets involved in derivatives and high speculative banking stuff, merchant banking, that's completely separate and it does not have access to the depositors' funds. So you protect it, and and he literally did. After a year, they split these banks down the middle, and so you had a commercially viable banking system. And if you have a look at the graph on the screen now, you'll see all of the bankruptcies that took place in the banking system up until the Glass-Steagall, and you see there's a whole great long period of time where there was no bankruptcies up until the Glass-Steagall started to be repealed. Mm-hmm. So look, what we're talking about, what Carney's talking about is not protecting the people. He's told us that he intends to rip off the households. Yep. This is where the blame's going to lie, not in the too big to fail banks. This is what we've been talking about. Now, as you said, they tried to get bail-in through the front door and there was a reaction. This is the backdoor thievery. This is, they know, as I said in this last clip, that people are stupid. They're stupid investors. Now, that's not a slur on people to say that people are stupid. What they're saying is that most people don't know how to deal with these complicated financial instruments.
And they wouldn't even know they're investing in it half the time. And of course, you can imagine that this new bubble being created where those kind of securities and bonds are bundled up and sold and resold, and you wouldn't even know what you're investing in.
Well, look, have a look at the history in Australia of the Commonwealth Bank and the sorts of frauds that the Commonwealth Bank's been involved in the recent period, where it's actually have to come out and apologise to its depositors and investors and so forth. When you've got these third parties involved with large amounts of money, you're going to end up in a deregulated system with a huge amount of criminal activity. That's why Roosevelt said we've got to have a legal separation of the banks, break them up and have a really highly regulated system. And when you have a highly regulated system, which is governed by law, you don't have this level of corruption, or if you do, you also have strong penalties to deal with it.
Yeah, and it was very interesting actually, because as people may have heard, Pope Francis wrote a letter to Tony Abbott as the chair of the G20, and he spoke about a number of things, but what I found interesting was when he specifically referred to the financial aspect of things at the G20, which is known largely because of us to be a big factor. And he said the international community, and in particular the G20 member states, should also give thought to the need to protect citizens of all countries from forms of aggression that are less evident, because he'd been talking about terrorism, etc., but equally real and serious. I'm referring specifically to abuses in the financial system, such as those transactions that led to the 2008 crisis, and more generally to speculation lacking political or juridical constraints, and the mentality that maximisation of profits is the final criterion of all economic activity. A mindset in which individuals are ultimately discarded will never achieve peace or justice. And it's interesting because just earlier that week, on the 11th of November, Abbott had written an article in the Australian Financial Review in which he said, unapologetically, we've put our focus on and our faith in the private sector, because making life easier for businesses to invest, to employ, to produce and to trade is what drives national growth and prosperity and helps lift people out of poverty. He said this is the priority for Australia's G20 host year, just as it is the Australian government's priority here at home every year. So he's talking about, private profit driving the economy, but there's a really distinct difference here between the philosophies that are being presented by the Pope and by Abbott, which we've also seen in hockey.
And also, if you have a look in the wider areas, like in the BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, their focus is about lifting their people out of poverty, and they're not going with this model of free trade and globalisation and the collapsing transatlantic banking system. So, I mean, Abbott's just speaking like a dutiful serf of the international banking community.
And we'll stop now, but we'll talk a bit more about what those BRICS countries are doing and the APEC Summit after this break. Welcome back to the CEC Report. APEC Summit proves transatlantic order on decline. Now, major efforts by the United States to stop discussion of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the new Silk Road proposals by BRICS nations, even with APEC being hosted by China and held in Beijing, those efforts by the US to stop discussion of that, and they did keep it officially off the agenda, but they absolutely failed to stop that being the topic of discussion. Obama was essentially sidelined and not much emphasis was on him at all. Most of the commentaries coming from other nations, including BRICS countries, described him as a lame duck anyway. Of course, you had the elections there, which our organisation described as a political impeachment by the American population. But if the United States and the UK had not been actively sabotaging the prospect of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Australia, for one, would have joined it when we were invited to a few weeks back.
And I must say, Elisa, we've launched a petition on this, demanding that our House of Representatives act to make Australia join the AIIB. It's absolutely insane that here we are in this corner of the globe, you know, major trading partners are in Asia, and we're snubbing them because of our pre-existing masters, UK and the UK particularly, are telling us, oh, we shouldn't challenge the existing financial structures like the World Bank and the IMF that have decimated and destroyed countries over the last 3, 4, 5 decades.
That's right, and given that we're saying, oh, we don't have the funds to do this or to do that, I mean, this is a source of funding without strings attached. And one of the things that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, raised at the APEC event is he announced that they are China is tripling their offshore investment by the end of the decade. So they want to uplift other countries because that's going to give them the trading partners that they need and uplift them too. Well,
this is how we'd build the Australian Ring Road. We went a high-speed, double-track magnetic levitation train system carrying freight and passengers right around the country. China's one of the leaders in high-speed maglev technology, but also high-speed train technology. We could be having a strategic partnership with them, both not just to use their technology to build this, but we could be transferring all our car manufacturing plants into building the rolling stock necessary, hundreds of trains necessary to be able to run around Australia at high speed, 600-700 kilometres plus. Now, I mean, this is a sort of far-reaching vision that we need for our country, but what are we getting? We're getting a bankers-dominated APEC forum, which is talking about developing global prosperity. When you hear the term global prosperity, what they mean is more free trade and actually more misery.
Yeah, and that's this G20 idea of expanding GDP by 2% and so forth. It's just words which won't have any impact, especially if it's the top 1% of people, the rich, who are going to make that extra income anyway.
Yeah, if we were to join the AIIB, we would develop our own national bank, like we've talked about on this program, similar to what the Commonwealth Bank did. I mean, we could transform this country through creating the large projects, participating with China in the space exploration. We've got Cape York, which is a brilliant space-based potential up there. We've got huge capacity. We could borrow and learn from them in their tunnelling and their canal technologies for the water transfer projects that we need in this country. We're a dry continent, we need more water. We've got tons of it in the north, and here you have a beautiful, natural, strategic partnership possible with China, but again, we're being blocked because this does not suit the interests, particularly of the City of London and Wall Street.
And the other thing that Xi Jinping announced along these lines was a $40 billion contribution to a new China-initiated Silk Road Fund. So Australia can fit in with that as part of the Maritime Silk Road as well. And he put the challenge to the United States, but it equally could be to us as the Deputy Sheriff in the region. He said China is ready to work with the United States to make efforts in a number of priority areas and putting into effect such principles as non-confrontation, non-conflict, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. So that's the kind of spirit we need to see. People should be ringing up their members of parliament. They should be ringing up their insurance funds and their super funds to stop this bail-in agenda, and instead to have nations cooperate with Asia, become a part of the focus of a new fair and just economic world order. Now, you can read more about all of this in our alert service. Thanks for tuning in. Join in again for next week's CEC Report.